So Dave, here we are,
Yeah.
the NRA show in Atlanta. It's April. Supreme Court is going to decide this case with Mexico trying to destroy all of this. They're going to decide this case anytime, but likely in June. It's coming up. And you worked on the amicus brief on this for the NRA to the Supreme Court on this case. Does it have a chance?
Does our side have a chance?
Well, I'm thinking of Mexico. It's a pretty outrageous claim that they're saying we're responsible for their gun violence.
I think not. I think it's looking like a loss for Mexico in the Supreme Court with at least 6 votes and perhaps up to 9.
So now, a pretty important question. Politically, why would Mexico to go down this road? It's not cheap to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court. It costs millions of dollars in many cases. It depends on a particular case. But why go through this whole process? Just for their politics at home? They're trying to blame America for their own crime issues?
If you look at the size of the budget controlled by the Mexican president, millions of dollars in legal fees are not that big a deal. And I don't know the details of how the dark money has been running around, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that the American anti-gun billionaires and their friends are helping on the legal costs for this.
Well, based on who the attorneys are in Washington, in D.C., and other stuff that I've seen, it looks like there is gun control money involved in backing this case, certainly in promoting this case.
Well, sure. One of the attorneys in the case from the early days was a guy named Jonathan Lowy, who had been the head of legal affairs for the group that used to be called Handgun Control, keeps changing its name like somebody on the run from the law. They're now called Brady United. But anyway, he was with them for a while and then left to found his own global anti-gun group exactly for suits like this. So I'd presume that when he left his salaried job with one gun ban group to found his own, he had good financial backing.
How much money, again, do they want from the gun industry for this case? What are they suing for?
About $10 billion.
$10 billion.
Plus drastic restructuring of the firearms industry.
They want all sorts of gun control laws.
Yeah.
If you read there.
Well, not laws, of course, but laws to be imposed by court order. The opposite of the democratic approach.
Right. Yeah. They want a judge, or the judge is, justices in this case, to come in and enact all sorts of restrictions on our Second Amendment.
Right.
Meanwhile, to bankrupt this firearms industry that we can hear in the background here.
Well, that's right. I started working on this issue in the late 1980s, and at the time the gun ban groups would say, oh, we can just ban guns outright because the Second Amendment doesn't really exist in any meaningful sense. It's not an individual right, or it's only an individual right to enlist in the National Guard, supposedly. But with current Supreme Court precedent, with the Heller case and its successors, they can't go all the way with that right now. So they're very good at trying alternative approaches, which like destroy the American firearms industry. And if you can do that, then you don't worry about the fact that people have a right to a firearm if they can't buy one.
Well, the Protection of Lawful and Commerce in Arms Act, the PLCAA, is supposed to stop these frivolous lawsuits, and it largely does, but they think they've found a marketing loophole they're using. Can you explain that?
Sure. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, enacted by a bipartisan supermajority in Congress, including one that beat a filibuster from the gun ban lobby, says if you're obeying the gun laws and you're a manufacturer, wholesaler, retailer, then you're fine and you can't be sued. On the other hand, if you're violating the gun laws, then you can be sued. So for example, let's say a dealer transfers a firearm to somebody without recording that transaction and the gun in his inventory book. That would be a violation of federal law, and if that gun were used in a crime, then the dealer who did that criminal transfer might be sued. The gun ban lobbies claim that there's also an implicit loophole for what they consider to be marketing they don't like. So, and it's preposterous. And then this came out in the oral argument that none of the justices found their marketing claims persuasive. So, for example, the Mexico and its gun ban lobby allies, and not really Mexico. Let's not blame the Mexican people. This is one nutty, extreme left Mexican president. She's not. Her actions were never authorized by Mexico's Congress. or anybody else. This is just the executive going off on her own thing. That some American manufacturers engrave flags on their American flags on their firearms, and supposedly that appeals to Mexican drug cartels. Very. I guess they're not loyal American citizens, and they all want to be Americans. That's why they buy guns with American flags. And likewise, Colt over the years, Colts has manufactured 3 firearms, mainly in 38 Super, with Mexican patriotic stuff on it. They did a limited production of 500 firearms for the 100th birthday of Emilio Zapata, who was a Mexican revolutionary from the early 20th century, populist, and fought against Mexico's despotic government at the time. And he had the famous quote, which is on this 500 firearm limited edition. It's better to live on your feet than die in. It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. And as Chief Justice Roberts pointed out, there's nothing illegal about saying that. And as Noel Francesco, who was the Smith and Wesson's attorney, one of the top appellate attorneys in the country, said to the court, it's really offensive and wrong for these plaintiffs to say that just because you do, for example, some of your advertising in Spanish, or you have guns that, with a Spanish name, like one of the Colt's guns was called El Grito, the cry, literally, which goes back to the cry of independence from the 1820s, when the Mexican people rose up and overthrew the Spanish colonialists and established their own independent republic. To say that is a violation of the law, which it's not, or that it's intended to appeal to cartels, is just preposterous. There's a lot of, as Francesco said, there are many, many, many patriotic American citizens, some of them of Latin American ancestry, some of them of Mexican ancestry, who speak Spanish, and there's nothing wrong with making firearms to appeal to those kinds of customers.
Whatever demographic that as long as you're here, we have a heavily regulated industry, maybe the most regulated industry.
Yes.
And selling legal products, not only legal products, but constitutionally protected products by our Second Amendment. And because they Cerakoted something on the firearm that is patriotic in Mexico, they somehow have broken. It's a ridiculous claim.
Well, you got to understand that these people are just shameless, brazen liars. Not everybody who's an anti-gun activist fits that description, but certainly the people behind this suit, the President Scheinbaum of Mexico, and many of the folks who work for the gun ban lobbies that are the allies in this suit. So another thing that came up at oral argument, and Justices Kagan and Sotomayor appeared to give this some credibility, but it's false. They said that American manufacturers sometimes make firearms with erasable or easily removable serial numbers. Well, there's actually a regulation from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives which says exactly how you're supposed to engrave the serial number on a firearm. And the regulation, so the Code of Federal Regulations, specifies the minimum depth, 3/1000th of an inch, and the minimum height for the serial number, 1/16th of an inch. And all the firearms manufacturers comply with that. ATF says do it this way, and they say, okay, that's exactly how we'll do it. And Mexico never alleges that any American manufacturer ever violated that law about the minimum depth and minimum height of the serial number. So again, it's just saying flagrant lies that get easily picked up by gullible media. But when you go one step further and look at the facts, there's no support. In fact, just the opposite.
I would call it gullible media, though. I would disagree with that. I think there's a certain part of the media that's on that side.
Yeah, that is certainly true. And I remember I talked to the Washington Post about this case shortly before oral argument, had a very solid conversation with the reporter who understood what I was saying. Like, for example, we talked about these paid Spanish language names for the guns, And I explained why it's preposterous to think that those are cartel guns. You know, a limited edition collector's edition, 300 guns, 500 guns for collector's editions are not the thing that cartels are buying. And she understood that, and yet that ridiculous claim appears in the article unrebutted as if it were a real fact.
Wow. Well, this is an important case, and you're very involved in it,
Yeah.
and thank you for all you've been doing. Also working with the NRA on this case. Where can people find out more about you and what you're working on, what's going on?
So I work at the Independence Institute, which is in Denver, Colorado. It's a state-level think tank, the second oldest of all the American state-level think tanks. And then my website is davekopel.org, DAVEKOPEL.org. And you can go there, and it's all free, lots of materials, including the joint brief of NRA and Independence Institute in the Smith and Wesson case. Joe Greenlee, who's the director of litigation for NRA, my co-author on the brief, he and I wrote a law journal article with more of the empirical data about where Mexican crime guns actually come from, which is certainly not from American retailers, and lots and lots of other free articles. So come there and educate yourself at no marginal cost.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for having me.